Star Wars 7x7 episode 2790. All right, we are getting near to the end of our series of debriefs about the Book of Boba Fett Season 1. Today we're going to talk about Luke Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So we've got some timeline stuff to parse out a little bit, and where I think we're going to end up with this is the possibility that Luke Skywalker is not done in Star Wars live action storytelling and that we might see him as soon as in the Ahsoka series whenever that debuts. But before we get there, let's start with a couple of current timeline reminders, things that we know to be true. For a start, the time period in which the events of Chapter 6 of the Book of Boba Fett happen, approximately 10 ABY, 10 years after the Battle of Yavin, which means 6 years after the events of Return of the Jedi. And at this point in time, Ben Solo is 5 years old. And it's not until 15 ABY, when Ben is 10 years old, that Luke starts to train Ben in the ways of the Jedi. And, you know, that's a little bit loosey-goosey from when the actual training academy starts, because we know that Ben Solo is the first student for Luke's Jedi Academy, but we don't necessarily know whether Luke just started training Ben before he actually got the academy going and then just, you know, made it official with Ben being his first student, or whether those things happened synonymously, contemporaneously. Concurrently, that's the word I think I'm really looking for. If it happened right at the same time. Yeah, going to 25-cent words when a couple of nickel words would have done. Anyway, so yeah, that's what we know. 10 ABY, 15 ABY, and maybe going on further down the line. But interestingly enough, in the Rise of Kylo Ren comic series, when Kylo Ren / Ben Solo is having his reflections about the start of the Academy, one thing that is probably worth flagging is that at the start, he doesn't have a beard. Luke Skywalker doesn't have a beard. And it isn't until later that he develops one. And so we are in a current phase of Luke Skywalker without a beard in 10 ABY. It has to last at least until 15 ABY. And then here's the other thing that we have to flag. So the end of Star Wars Rebels, and we've talked about this from time to time, that takes place maybe, or at least I think the thinking had been that it was around 4 ABY. It was not long after the events of Return of the Jedi, when Ahsoka comes back to Lothal and picks up Sabine and says it's time to go look for Ezra Bridger because he disappeared along with Thrawn and the Purrgil and that whole Star Destroyer at the end of the final season, the final episode of Star Wars Rebels. So Dave Filoni had thrown a little water on the notion of that being immediately after the events of Return of the Jedi, that it could have happened a little bit farther ahead in the timeline. So it turns out that I think we can actually get some of this to line up. The events of the end of Star Wars Rebels and the Book of Boba Fett and The Mandalorian, particularly Chapter 13, The Jedi. So in the Star Wars book, which came out in late 2020, co-written by Pablo Hidalgo and Dan Zare and Cole Horton, there's a thing about Ahsoka deciding to return to the Ghost Crew and go on a mission to the unknown regions to look for Ezra. And we see her not in the unknown regions in Chapter 13 of the Jedi, finding out where, or asking after Grand Admiral Thrawn, trying to find out where he is. So if we say that the answer to that question is that he's in the unknown regions somewhere, then it makes sense that Ahsoka goes from that point to get Sabine and they go off on their journey together. That's one potential option. The other option is that the information she gets is not complete and she still has to go hunting, and it isn't until the end of that episode of Chapter 6 of the Book of Boba Fett when she's taken off from the Jedi planet and Luke says, "Well, I see you again," and she says, "Perhaps," and goes off. Maybe she's heading off to Lothal at that point right there. But what seems to be clear at this point is that Ahsoka was already aware of Luke Skywalker's presence. And so the scenes in The Jedi in Chapter 13 of The Mandalorian, where she instructs the Mandalorian to take Grogu to the planet Tython and plop him on the Seeing Stone, and maybe some Jedi will show up. Well, she may not know what Luke is up to at that point, and Luke isn't starting to build the Jedi Academy until after he gets a hold of Grogu. So what has Luke been doing for the last 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, or 6 years, I guess, because he's not involved in any of the events that happen with the Aftermath novels. He's gone off on his own. There is a thing in the story mode of Star Wars Battlefront 2 where he encounters Del Meeko, for example, and he's basically going to various he's doing research on Jedi sites and looking up Jedi artifacts and that sort of thing, but he ended up at one of the Emperor's observatories, which is what that whole Battlefront 2 situation was. And it seems as though we are given to understand and believe that for these 6 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, he has been traipsing around the galaxy trying to uncover all of this Jedi information, trying to construct enough of the backstory of the Jedi Order that he feels as though he can start his own Jedi Academy. And so he's picked a place where he can settle and start the build. But now that Grogu has decided not to go on with the school and is off on his own, now we have Luke Skywalker building a Jedi Academy without any students whatsoever. And he's not going to have his first one until, 5 years later at a minimum. So what is he going to do for the next 5 years? And I suppose it might be time to re-examine The Legends of Luke Skywalker, that book by Ken Liu that came out a few years ago. And yes, a lot of that is supposed to be, oh yeah, it's not necessarily real because it's people in universe telling stories about Luke Skywalker, and so the veracity of them is definitely in question. But there may be some stuff that would be indicative, and especially now that we've had a lot more canon storytelling, that we might be able to connect some dots. And the dots are there to be connected. For example, in the Rise of Kylo Ren comic series that we were just talking about earlier, there is a mission to a planet called Afrona that happens when Luke has a beard and Kylo is a little bit older. And Elfrona is the planet that we actually see in the not in the Rising Storm, excuse me, in Light of the Jedi. That's where Loden Greystorm and Bel Zettifar are stationed, and where Loden is initially kidnapped from by the Nile. Funnily enough, both of those stories written by Charles Soule, both The Rise of Kylo Ren and Light of the Jedi. In other words, it's pretty clear that the fine folks at Lucasfilm live for making these connections, and making these connections be years apart, and knowing that, oh, these are little Easter eggs that are going to be discovered over time. But they've already brought in Luke Skywalker twice, once at the end of The Mandalorian and just for a little cameo situation, once for a lot longer in the Book of Boba Fett Chapter 6. So yeah, doesn't it make sense that Luke Skywalker would probably show up again in a series like the Ahsoka series, and for probably a bit longer than we've seen so far? And that seems to be another trait of the stuff that we're seeing from Lucasfilm over the last couple of years. Not just the interconnectedness, but also pushing the envelope as far as visual effects go with the CGI and the AI voice stuff. Yeah, every indication that they are just going to continue to push that envelope and make that do more and more heavy lifting in the storytelling. So ultimately, yeah, thanks to the Book of Boba Fett, we see that Luke was trying to set up his temple as early as 10 ABY, and he couldn't get it off the ground. And he wouldn't get it off the ground for another 5 years. So, yeah, maybe that's more of the kinds of failure stories that Yoda is hoping that Luke will reflect on in his time in The Last Jedi. But anyway, that's where we're going to leave things with Luke and Ahsoka, and I'd love to hear what you think about what he will be doing in the 5 years in between 10 ABY and 15 ABY. Drop a comment on YouTube if you're checking the video version of this out, or if you are checking the audio version out, please head over to sw7x7.com and look for episode 2790. And that is going to do it for this episode of the show. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.